Hello everyone, my name's Minty Ledger and I'm Deputy Director at Cambridge University Health Partners, and I'd like to welcome you to our latest Cambridge Biomedical Campus on Virtual Tour event. We have covered a diverse range of topics so far since moving online last year, from the early detection of cancer to the future of cystic fibrosis treatments and latest cardiovascular research. All of these reflect the latest developments across the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, and they're available on the CBC YouTube channel to catch up on. This lunchtime, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Giles Yeo, a programme leader at the MRC Metabolic Diseases Unit in Cambridge, whose research focuses on the influence of genes on the way we eat and on our weight. Giles is also a broadcaster and author, presenting science documentaries for BBC's Horizon and Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. Giles will discuss his work studying the brain's control of food intake and body weight, how those insights can inform our own everyday eating choices, and why obesity is more complex than you might think. As usual, throughout this afternoon's talk, if you're watching through Zoom, you can ask questions at any time using the Q&A box, and these will then be addressed at the end of the talk. We will do our best to include any comments made by those on YouTube Live, but please don't be too disappointed if yours is not included, as we often have a very chatty audience. And finally, to reassure you all, you won't be seen or heard throughout this event, but it will be recorded and then made available on our website afterwards, and a link will be sent to you via email. So without further ado, thank you very much to Giles, and I'm sure you will enjoy his talk. Thank you very much.
So much for asking me to do this, Jill and Minty. And thank you. I'm questioning your life decisions, by the way, those of you who have actually volunteered to come and listen to me during your lunchtime. Hopefully I won't disappoint you. I can take off my glasses. I don't have to do a lot of reading. Hello, my name is Giles Yeo, and I work here at the Cambridge Biomedical Campus, specifically at the Institute of Metabolic Science, where I study obesity. I study body weight actually, but obesity sits on one end of the spectrum. Now I'm a geneticist by trade, and I think being a geneticist is, well, it's a very upstanding thing to do. I'd like to think so. You know, my mother-in-law still speaks to me, so that's a positive. But when people ask me what disease I study, because geneticists often use it primarily as a tool to understand a trait, to understand a disease, and I say obesity, immediately I become the bad person. Now, and I become the bad person because I'm perceived as giving fat people, overweight people, people living with obesity, and terms I do not use in any pejorative fashion whatsoever, an excuse. Now, philosophically, I've always found this an interesting way of actually looking at the issue, because if I was studying the genetics of I don't know, dementia, the genetics of cancer, the genetics of rheumatoid arthritis, would I suddenly be giving those people suffering from those conditions an excuse? No. I mean, I'd be trying to understand biology, mechanisms. God forbid, I might be trying to help somebody. But yet, when we talk about body weight, when we talk about obesity, okay, suddenly it becomes I'm giving someone an excuse. And that's because people believe that body weight is a choice, that people choose to be the size that they are. And therefore, if someone is larger than they should be, that is their fault, that they're choosing to be the size they are. So I want you to consider this lunchtime seminar a rebuttal. Okay, now I hope I will convince you, but if not, I'm happy to take some shoes thrown my way after we're done. So now I think all of us have seen versions of this scales of justice, this energy balance equation. And this is otherwise known as the first law of thermodynamics. So you can't magic energy from anywhere, and you certainly can't magic the energy away. Okay, this is conservation of energy. So the only way, ladies and gentlemen, the only way that you can gain weight is to eat more than you burn. Ergo, the only way you can lose weight is to burn more than you eat. I don't know what you guys are thinking. Did he just say eat less and move more? Yes, I did. And you might be thinking, we really just burnt our lunch to hear some dude say that, you know, some old-fashioned statement. Well, that's because it's true. That's because it's physics. It's a fundamental law. How we get to the body weight we are now is because of physics, is because of eating too much and moving too little, or eating less and moving more. But, and this is the but, the question to ask is not the how, which is going to be physics, but the why. Why do people behave so differently around food? So why do some people, for example, respond to stress by eating and other people respond to stress by not eating? It's the same hormone, it's cortisol, yet diametric opposites. Why do some people love food? I love food. Whereas other people, use food as fuel. I share an office when we could share offices with a colleague of mine over the past decade. Every single day during lunch, he eats the same cheese sandwich, the exact same cheese sandwich. So he uses food as fuel because I love my food. I know exactly what I'm going to have for dinner tomorrow night, what I'm going to have for dinner Sunday night, and plausibly what I'm going to have for dinner next week because I love my food and I think about food. And all of these different behaviors around food, and there are a gazillion others, ultimately influences the physics. Because if some people love food more or less, are drawn towards food more or less, feel hungrier or less, this influences how much food you eat, which ultimately influences your body weight. And when we're talking about this different behaviors around food, we're going to be talking about biological variability. Now, I think we all have seen versions of this of this graph here showing this pandemic. This is a non-communicable pandemic, okay, but it is still a pandemic of diet-related illnesses, of which obesity is probably key amongst them. Okay, the vast burden of non-communicable, non-infectious diseases that we as a world face today are diet-related. And I just want to show you this, not because you don't know and haven't heard these in the news at all, but just to point out that we're nowhere near the maximum of this problem. So yes, North America, where we are here in Western Europe, everything is well discussed. We almost know everything. We can turn on the TV and watch about it all the time. But I wanted to just draw your attention that we're nowhere near the maximum of the problem because of this tiny corner of the world over here, the Indian subcontinent and China. Now, there are probably 300 million or so mainland Chinese people with the same disposable income that you or I might have, and they go vacation to the same places that we do. Same number probably of South Asian Indians, another 300 million people. But you have to remember, okay, that there are an additional 1 billion people stuck out in the sticks in China and another billion in the Indian subcontinent, for whom being in poverty means not having enough food and therefore being skinny. Okay, unlike now in the environment we live in the higher income countries in the world, so to speak, where there is an uncomfortable link, a very close link between socioeconomic class, okay, and disease, in particular obesity. So in other words, the poorer you are, the less privileged you are, the more likely you are to become obese. Okay, so while when China and India begins to drag their populations, those populations in poverty, out of poverty, which is what they're aiming to do, and why shouldn't they? And then an additional 2 billion people in the world are exposed to the same environment we are. We will then begin to hit the maximum of the problem, and we want to try and sort this out before it actually. We want to try and sort this out soon. Okay, now this is like a nerd's graph. Okay, you might be wondering, why am I showing you this? So the data from this particular graph, this moving 6D graph, comes from the Center for Disease Control, the US CDC. I stole the GIF from the Washington Post. All right, and what it shows here is a couple of things. It's plotting obviously males and females. There's a moving time. And it's plotting frequency of BMI. Now, BMI is body mass index, is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters square, and it's imperfect, and we can discuss that later, okay? But we know the numbers, right? In theory, a BMI between 20 and 25 is considered normal, whatever that means. Between 25 and 30 is overweight, and above 30 is considered obese, right? So now if we take those numbers as read for now, then the average BMI of a male in 1984, we'll let the time stamp go back, boom, is around 22 to 23. Okay, so in other words, normal weight, normal BMI. Whereas in 2014, when this data ends, it's 27. And the same is true for females. So suddenly we have become more overweight as a species. So if we use the prism, okay, I study the genetics of body weight. Can genetics explain the shift in body weight over between 1984 and 2014? And the answer is clearly no. And it's no because our genes haven't changed. So I have been alive throughout this entire process from 84 to 2014. And I'm sure many of you have been alive either throughout the entire process or through the vast majority of this particular process. All right. And this has happened. We haven't evolved a second head. Okay. So this change has occurred a background of a static gene pool. Okay. Now, but, and this is the big but, if we look at the histogram from 1984, all right. So now, if in theory, this increase in body weight is all due to the environment, eating less, moving more, eating more, moving less, okay, and has no biological impact at all, no biological variability, then in theory, the histogram from 1984 should move in its entirety upwards so that you actually see a shape that kind of looks like the Golden Gate Bridge. But that's not what you see. What you see is a changing shape of the histogram. If we assume that everyone alive in 1984 is still alive in 2014, and that's a safe assumption by and large, then the only way to change the shape of a histogram under some kind of environmental perturbation or insult, everybody in that histogram has to be responding differently to that change in environment. So what we say in the field is, why have we become more heavier, larger, more obese as a species? Because of the change in environment. But how much weight we gain? Do we gain any weight at all? Where do we sit on the population distribution of body weight? That is powerfully biologically and hence genetically influenced. And where is this evidence? Where is this evidence that there is a genetic input to body weight? As with many other human traits, a large part of this has come from twin studies. So I'll just briefly précis twin studies. Some of you may know what it is, but I'll briefly précis it so that we're all on the same level. Now, they're going to be identical twins. Okay, so these are genetic clones of each other for all intents and purposes, and non-identical twins. And they would share as much genetic material as you would with your own siblings, or for that matter, your parents, 50%. So therefore, if you study enough twins, then you can ask the question for any given human trait and ask, well, what happens if I study people who have all their genes identical, 100%, okay, identical twins, versus only half their genes the same, okay? They can work out what they call, geneticists can work out what they call heritability, which is the percentage of the variation of a given trait that's down to your genes. Let me give you a couple of examples. If I had hair, my hair would be black. Now, hair color is very powerfully biologically and genetically influenced with very little environmental impact. Dyeing your hair does not count. I'm talking about your natural hair color, all right? Now, let's take another trait, freckles. Now, freckles are clearly going to have a genetic impact as well, but whether or not they appear, how many appear, even amongst identical twins, would entirely depend on whether or not I like to stand in the sun. Do I like to wear t-shirts? So there we have a powerful genetically influenced trait with an equally powerful environmental impact. As it turns out, every single human trait and behavior, will have a genetic influence. The difficulty is trying to understand the role that the environment plays. Because the environment is volatile, it changes every single minute of every day, unlike your genes, which are static, okay? So if you do that maths, then the heritability of body weight is actually 70%, all right? So it's not 0%, it's certainly not 100%. Just to put things in perspective, the heritability of height, of which no one here, I would hope, would argue that there would be a powerful genetic influence, the heritability of height is 85%. So the heritability of body weight is actually approaching that of height. And so what do some of these genes do? Well, the first of these molecular handles, the first of these genes to be identified was a gene called leptin. And it was identified in 1994 in this mouse who's more than twice the weight of its litter mates. Okay, so this mouse, as it turns out, has a mutation in the gene called leptin. Now, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk, in effect, talking about leptin and its biology and its signaling pathway, and I'll go on to explain why. But this mouse has a naturally occurring mutation in this gene called leptin, making it severely obese. So what is leptin? Well, leptin, as it turns out, is a hormone that's produced from fat. And the more fat you have, the more leptin you have. Now, leptin is secreted from the fat to actually circulate within the bloodstream, where it signals to the brain the level of fat you have in your body. Why is this important? This is important because how much fat you're carrying is how long you would last in the wild without any food. Not a problem today when we have too much food, but a problem in the past where we never had enough food. So how long you would survive if there was not enough food was an important integer to actually hold in your head. All right. So based on this initial finding now in 1994, we now have a general schema on how our body weight is actually regulated and how our food intake is regulated. So now, as it turns out, this is a top-down control and it's controlled by the brain. And your brain needs to know two pieces of information in order to influence your food intake and hence your body weight. The first piece of information it needs is how much fat you have, because how much fat you have, I've just said, is how long you'd last in a while without any food. But the second thing that your brain needs to know is what you have just eaten and what you are currently eating. These are going to be your short-term signals, and they're going to come from your gut, your gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so every mouthful of food you eat, it goes down your esophagus, into your stomach, through the small intestine and large intestine and out the other side. Hormones are released from the gut throughout the entire process, which let your brain know not only how much you've eaten, but what you've eaten. So your brain then senses these short-term and long-term signals, and then integrates, translates the signals, and then influences your next interaction with a menu, with your fridge, or with the supermarket. Okay. Now there are genetic modifiers, as I've said, that run throughout this entire process. And geneticists, such as myself, such as the guys I work with here in the hospital, have been able to leverage these genetic modifiers to understand new biology. And we now know, for example, that the leptin melanocortin pathway is one of the key pathways that actually controls food intake and ultimately influences your body weight. So what is the leptin melanocortin pathway? I'll go through it quickly and then give you some examples. So leptin, produced from fat, I've already told you this, signals to a part of the brain, okay, where a set of neurons called the POMC neurons are activated. These produce melanocortin peptides, which signal to the melanocortin 4 receptor, influencing food intake and body weight. Okay, that's the summary. We know this is important because if you disrupt every single level of the signaling pathway, whether or not you have whiskers and a tail, or whether you don't have whiskers and a tail, you result in severe obesity. And so I'm going to come back and actually give you just a couple of key examples in multiple species, okay, to highlight my point about the importance of this pathway and its broad applicability through evolution. So let's start with humans. So the mouse was identified, the mouse with the leptin mutation was identified in 1994. And soon after, this is where my current head of department, Professor Sir Stephen O'Rahilly, who's the head of department of the Department of Clinical Biochemistry, came on the scene. And he mused, he says, well, okay, well, if you could have a mutation in one mammalian species, the mouse, which resulted in obesity, because remember, that mouse was a naturally occurring mouse. It wasn't a genetically modified mouse. Well, then, is this pathway, this so-called leptin pathway, more applicable? So in other words, was it relevant for humans? But was his question. Or was it a weird mousy thing? It could have been a weird mousy thing. Mice are small, have whiskers, have tails. But to cut a long story short, Steve and his, at the time, clinical fellow, Sadaf Farooqi, now Professor Sadaf Farooqi, went looking, and they found the first two kids with congenital leptin deficiency. So they had mutations in exactly that same gene for leptin, different mutations, but mutations. So this is what humans that don't have leptin look like. And I put some descriptors here. So they start at a normal birth weight. Okay, so they're born out normal size. But then they become hyperphagic after weaning. So hyper for more, phagic for eat. All right. Now it's a pathogenic term though, ladies and gentlemen. So you can't say, oh, I was hyperphagic last night. No, you ate too much. Okay. So hyperphagia is a pathogenic feeding behavior. So these kids, for example, have to have their freezer doors locked up because they will actually break in to try and eat the frozen fish fingers. Now, I know what you guys are thinking, ew. But I'm going to come back and actually give you a scenario where this is not actually as weird as you might actually initially seem. Then you can see the rest here. There's no defect in energy expenditure as far as we can tell. A lot of fat, normal height. They don't undergo puberty and have impaired immune function. which seems slightly odd thing to talk about within an obesity lecture, but I'm going to come back and explain to you why these two endocrine phenotypes really begin to give us a grounding on the biology of leptin. So here's a closer look at the child. This is the younger child now. He's 3 years old, weighing 42 kilograms. Multiplied by 2.2 for pounds, divided by 14 for stone. All right. So just for perspective, I am 5'9" and I weigh 75 kilograms. So this is a 3-year-old who's 2/3 of my body weight. Okay. So this, if you needed to be persuaded, is not I've drunk too much soda, played too much PlayStation, didn't exercise enough type of obesity. There's something seriously wrong with this child, and he lacks the signal from fat to tell his brain how much fat he has. Now, Steve then asked the question, Steve O'Rahilly then asked the question, well, okay, fat is a hormone. This child lacks a hormone. If we take type 1 diabetes as an analogy in which you lack insulin, and so therefore you have to inject yourself daily with insulin in order to control your glucose homeostasis, Steve then asked, well, if you inject yourself with leptin, can you then manage your fat homeostasis? And to cut a long story short, this is the same child, now 7 years old, now weighing 32 kilograms. The only difference is daily injections of leptin. Now, at the time, the patent for leptin was held by the Rockefeller University, where the molecule was first discovered, but licensed to the American pharmaceutical giant Amgen. Oh boy, to have been in the boardroom when the results came in, I mean, they must have wet themselves. They must have thought that all their Christmases had come in one go because they'd solved obesity forever. Except they hadn't. Because look at the date. This child here, this was published in 1999, 22 years ago. And leptin is certainly not the panacea for obesity. It wasn't like Amgen didn't try, just to point things out. Amgen gave leptin to old people, young people, males, females, and people of all different colors. And there was one universal truth. If you had a functioning leptin system, and this child does not have a functioning leptin system, then you did not respond to additional leptin injected into you, certainly when it came to food intake. So the question is why? Given when you didn't have a functioning leptin system, you were exquisitely sensitive. Well, it all has to do with the role of leptin. So people initially thought that leptin was acted as a negative feedback loop. Because it was produced more the fatter you were, that it would then signal to the brain to let you to eat less. That you might consider this treatment of the child as a proof of principle. So too much fat, too much leptin, signal to the brain, eat less, lose weight. Except that it doesn't make any evolutionary sense, because when through evolution would we have a scenario where we had too much food that we had to design an entire system to stop us getting too fat? Never is the answer. So to cut another long story short, leptin doesn't function, as it turns out, when there's loads of it sloshing about, letting your brain know you have too much fat. Leptin functions when it disappears, letting your brain know when you have too little fat. When do you have too little fat? When you're starving. Leptin is a starvation hormone. It's there to turn on the starvation response. So what is the starvation response? Eat. That seems obvious. Now, all of us know, we go through this every day, that if you're really hungry, the simplest foods taste delicious. A bit of bread, a bit of cheese, a bit of rice, delicious. But the fuller we become, the more picky we become with our food, okay? We go through this every single day. But imagine if you were actually starving. Plane crash in the Andes, your partner is looking delicious, starving. Would you end up eating frozen fish fingers to keep yourself alive? Yes, you would. All mammals, all living creatures probably, become hyperphagic when they're actually starving in order to keep themselves alive. You won't end up eating something poisonous because that will kill you. So that defeats the entire purpose. But you will eat food that normally, under your normal scenario, you would consider unpalatable, such as frozen food. What else happens? Your brain, okay, which is controlling all of this, then needs to begin to triage calories for itself. Your brain is 2 to 3% of your body weight, but at rest now, it is using up 25% of the circulating glucose in your blood. It's metabolically very expensive because it does all the command and control. So it needs to save calories for itself so that even in your haze of hunger, you're able to put together a cogent strategy in order to track down food. So what does it do? It begins to shut down immediately expensive, metabolically expensive, but immediately unimportant pathways. Reproduction is one of those pathways. Ladies, you know that at that time of the month, okay, loads of wasted calories, which at the edge of starvation is the difference between life and death. So your brain shuts the whole damn thing off, right? Now, anyway, if you were actually starving, the last thing you're going to want to do is to plop a baby out into the Serengeti, because how are you going to feed the baby? You're starving. So reproduction turned off. The other thing, which is very expensive, is your immune system. Okay, and so your brain tunes the whole thing down because the likelihood of dying of starvation far outweighs getting some kind of infection. But the whole system is reversible, because this child, okay, you see, when given back leptin, when suddenly your brain has leptin, senses leptin again, eating is fixed, the hyperphagia is fixed because the child loses the weight. How about reproduction? Well, his older cousin, remember this is 1999, his older cousin is now in her 30s, has a family. She's the first leptin deficient living being in all of evolution to have a family because of daily injections of leptin, and both their immune functions are now normal. So that is what leptin does. It sits there and acts to turn on the starvation response. Okay, so that's what happens then when it signals to the brain. Well, it hits the POMC neurons. Okay, so now at this point, I could show you pictures of kids with mutations in POMC, and they would look exactly the same as this child over here, except with bright orange hair. I could show you the animal models we've created, but I thought I'd share with you some research we've done on Labrador Retrievers. That's right. So this work, by the way, was led by a veterinary surgeon colleague of mine, Eleanor Raffin. Okay. Now, I think a number of you out there will own Labradors as pets because they are the most common pet dog in the UK and in North America. I mean, for Pete's sake, we use them to sell toilet paper in this country. Okay. Now, but for any of you who own Labradors, you know you have to keep your compost bin shut because the Labradors will be in there in a shot and eat everything in there till they nearly pop. They are one of the most food motivated dogs, greedy, whatever you will call them, out there. And Eleanor was interested in why the Labrador Retrievers were quite as greedy as they were, even compared to other dog species, the other dog breeds. Okay, and so as it turns out, to cut another long story short, I'm just giving you summaries here. A percentage of Labradors have a deletion in POMC, not all of them. So because not all of them have it, you can do what we call a genotype-phenotype correlation, meaning we can match the genes to their weight, for example. And you can see that here, wild type means no mutation, heterozygous means 1 copy, homozygous means 2 copies. And you can see that for each deletion of this particular gene, they are on average 2 kilos heavier. So that when you have 2 copies versus no copies of the deletion, the dog is about 4 kilos heavier. It doesn't sound like a lot until you remember that Labradors only get to around 30 to 35 kilos. Now, if you do the same thing for food motivation, you'll see exactly the same relationship, okay? Clearly driving the obesity phenotype that is there. So here are the numbers. Once again, I said at 1.9 kilos or 0.3 of a standard deviation of body weight per allele. But as I said, not all Labradors have it. About 25% of Labradors will have this deletion. But 95% of Labradors are really, really quite food motivated. So Eleanor is funded at the moment by the Wellcome Trust, she and her team, in order to try and throw the genetic book at this to find other genetic drivers driving Labrador food motivation. But POMC deletion is a key and very powerful driver. But this is not the end of the story. Because not only are Labradors wonderful family pets because of their temperament, okay, they're also tremendously trainable. In fact, they're so trainable, they're primarily used as guide dogs for the blind, certainly within the UK and in the United States, okay, and in North America. Now, guide dogs are like the Navy SEALs of the dog world because they're about to be given a human being to look after for the rest of their lives. And they're trained, and it's huge failure rate. Okay, the few, the proud, the guide dogs, and those that fail become pets, right? And those huge selection pressure, huge training regime that's in there, the dogs are typically trained using standard Pavlovian techniques with food. Okay, so this is now their driving selection pressure. And if you look at successful Labrador guide dogs, certainly within our cohort, we find that nearly 80% of the successful guide dogs within our cohort had the deletion in POMC. So this is the concept, all right? Here's guide dog. Here's visually impaired Mr. Smith or Mrs. Smith, all right? So imagine, and the guide dog's taking Mr. Smith home, imagine if a chicken ran across the road. It could happen. What are the chances of a chicken dinner? Is it 50-50? Is it 80-20? Don't matter, right? because the dog, the guide dog, the successfully trained with food guide dog, is trained that it will have a 100% chance of dinner should he bring Mr. Smith home safely. So we started by looking at food motivation, and suddenly, because of the selection pressure on display, found ourselves looking at trainability of dogs instead. And we ended up on the cover of the journal. So this this is a chocolate Labrador, one of our participants, and that is Eleanor, who actually led the study. So for those of you who own Labradors and you go back and you see Fido with big googly eyes and you say, oh, Fido loves me. Fido doesn't love you. Fido's hungry. Terrible, terrible thing to say. So what happens with POMC? POMC are converted into melanocortin peptides, which then signal to the melanocortin 4 receptor or MC4 receptor. And we now know that mutations in MC4 receptor, and you shouldn't be surprised now either, result in severe human obesity. In fact, we now know that mutations in the MC4 receptor are the commonest single gene cause of increased body weight and obesity that we actually know. We just have a piece of work that's just been accepted for publication about a month ago now, where we, within a UK-based population study, find that 1 in 330 people, okay, with no body weight cutoff, 1 in 330 people in this country will have a mutation in the MC4 receptor, explaining in large part how heavy they might actually be. And this is not a weird human thing, by the way, this MC4 receptor thing. And the moment you begin to realize that MC4 receptor is actually mutations in the MC4 receptor are actually relatively common, you begin to understand that it is a useful handle, it's a useful lever for Mother Nature to actually tweak your feeding behavior, to adjust one's behavior to the environment that one's in. Let me give you an example. Let's look at agricultural-based animals such as pigs. When I first published that paper with the first human with the MC4 mutation, this would have been in 1998. You know, I went on tour, so to speak. I went to the lecture circuit. And on one of these places, a lady approached me after I got off stage. And it turns out she was from an agricultural breeding company. And once again, these are breeding companies. They're not genetically modifiable animals, nothing of that sort. They were picking pigs, okay, with specific traits, one of which is fast growing and a good fat to lean mass ratio. Okay, these are the key points of the meat industry. And actually, a number of the pig lines, on this particular pig line, for example, which they send for using to make bacon, these pigs actually have mutations in the MC4 receptor, making them naturally grow faster. Okay, eat more and grow faster without any weird hormone injection. So these are organic pigs almost, but selected, and because of the selection, actually have mutations in the MC4 receptor. This is not weird mammalian thing either. So let me introduce you to the blind Mexican cavefish. So not only are they fish, they're blind. Not only are they blind, they're Mexican. So here are boring fish with eyes, just very passe, all right? And here are the blind Mexican cavefish. So why are they blind and why are they Mexican? So look, that big asteroid that killed the dinosaurs hit around where the Gulf of Mexico is now, okay? Thus Mexican. So when it hit, it made a lot of cracks and within the crust and the mantle, and these then filled with water, okay, and became underwater caves. And some fish got stuck in these underwater caves. Because they're underwater caves, there's no light, and so the fish that got stuck there became blind. Their eyes just went away because they didn't need the eyes to actually function. But the other thing that happens within an underwater cave is there is really a paucity, very little food in there. Okay, so any fish, okay, that was slightly blasé about the piece of plankton or whatever algae that kind of drifts by, slightly blasé and didn't actually go chase it down, became an ex-fish. Okay, so only the fish that were food motivated enough to chase after the rare times food actually entered the cave survived to this day. So that now all blind Mexican cavefish surviving today have mutations, you got it, in the MC4 receptor, because the natural selection that happened there made sure that only those food motivated enough could survive. All right, so here's my question. Where's the choice, ladies and gentlemen? These are fish. This is a pig. All they have been under was a selection pressure and an adaptive rewiring, okay, of that through genes, obviously, of their brains to make them more food motivated, to make them change their feeding behavior. One more, okay, down. I feel like a Dr. Doolittle here talking about animals, but one more little example to impress home the point. Can we make fruit flies fat? So this is a piece of work that I've just published recently. Now, these are fruit flies. These are the kind of flies that appear when your bananas go brown, all right? And so we have ways of actually measuring feeding behavior in these flies using what we call a cafe assay. So flies like yeast and sugar. And so if you mix them together in liquid form, this is a capillary here, and you can see these black marks, okay? We use the black marks to mark the meniscus of where we actually put in the food. And you can put in a number of flies, and then what you happen is you can then measure how quickly the food goes down. So you have millimeters in food going down over time for food intake. So if you look at the data, ND stands for normal diet. Okay, so these are flies that were on a normal diet and then transferred into this setup, and they eat food at per fly, whatever, 0.75 millimeters per day or whatever the number is. What happens if you fast the fly? If you actually put the fly on a 24-hour fast, well, they eat more. You make them eat more. What happens if you put the fly on a high-fat diet, make them go, oh, make them stuffed? They eat less than the controls. Now, flies don't have a full melanocortin system, but they do have one of the enzymes that processes POMC. Okay, so one of these key enzymes. And when we mutate that enzyme, they end up, okay, becoming obese as well. Okay, where is the choice? These are flies. Oops, accidentally, I've killed a fly. All right, but yet because of genes within their brain, we are able to change that feeding behavior, ladies and gentlemen. This is my point. And we humans have them. And this is why they're as common as they are, 1 in 330. And there are other genes as well. I'm just focusing on one gene to kind of press home the point that a lot of our feeding behavior is going to be the result of selection pressures that have occurred over the past tens of thousands of years, and our response to the environment in order to make sure that we're surviving today. Now, one key point I want to make, though, is that these are all single genes. In other words, one gene mutated or whatever and having an effect. But actually, for the majority of us, our body weight is not determined just by one gene. It's determined by many genes. So this is monogenic, one gene, versus polygenic, many genes, okay, from there. And we're now, because of advances in technologies, have a good idea about the genetic architecture of body weight. And this is not just the being obese. We're talking the genetic architecture of being small, medium, or large, the full Goldilocks spectrum of body weight. Now, this particular Jackson Pollock diagram that is here, you don't have to look at each of the individual genes, but I want you to take away two messages, okay? Now, there are two broad groups of genes here. I want to argue there's a big pink blob up here, and there's a large blue blob down here, all right? And there's very little overlap. So the genes in the pink blob up here have to do with your waist to hip ratio. So it's the circumference of your waist over the circumference of your hip, and you take the ratio. And if you think about what that means, that is indicating your body shape, correct? Do I have a big bum versus a small tummy? Do I have a big tummy versus a small bum? Do I look like a sausage? Okay, this is where you put your fat. The genes in blue down here are all about BMI, independent of where you put your fat. This is how much fat you have. So message number one, where you put your fat has very, very little to do with how much fat you have. Okay, that genetically distinct pathways. Okay, that's the first message. Second message, where you put your fat has to do with genes that act within your fat. Okay, this is unsurprising, but how much fat you have, how fat you become, whether or not you're small, medium, or large, these are genes that occur within the brain, and where we know their function influence feeding behavior. So this is another way of looking at the data. This is otherwise known as a Manhattan plot. Okay, now this gene FTO, I have spent over 14 years of my life studying, 14 years. But yet this is the first time I've mentioned it. That's because it's a very sad story, and lunchtime you don't want to hear sad stories, other than to indicate that FTO, these are not mutations, all right? So half of you listening to me right now will have the risk factors for FTO, one risk factor for FTO, which makes you on average 1.5 kilos heavier than the person next door to you who doesn't have any, and 1/6 of you, about 1 billion people in the world, would have 2 of the risk copies of FTO, making you on average 3 kilograms heavier and 50% more likely to become obese over your lifetime. okay? All of you will have some mix of these genes that are here. So what are some of these other genes? I've just highlighted two, which I've already mentioned. Here on the left-hand side, POMC, okay, of Labrador fame. And here on the right-hand side, the MC4 receptor of human beings, pigs, and blind Mexican cavefish fame. This is the leptin melanocortin pathway, not mutation. So while mutations in a pathway results in severe obesity and big effects, which I've showed you, very, very, very subtle changes amongst all of us in these same genes ends up influencing where we sit on the normal distribution of body weight. So you can now create even a risk score, a so-called polygenic risk score, where you add up, because there are now over 1,000 genes, 1,000 genes we know that are linked to body weight. And so you can construct a risk score by counting all of the everything that you have up. Okay, and you can, do they make me slightly heavier, make me slightly lighter? And if you actually plot them against BMI, you see a linear relationship. So the more risk factors you have, the more likely you are to become to be heavier, which begs the point. Well, can we predict what's going to happen to someone before they even before just when they're born, before they even gain any weight at all? Can we find the people at high genetic risk and intervene? And these are what a lot of these companies are trying to do. So this is 23andMe, for example. Other testing companies exist. I'm just drawing, they all make the same error. They try and do this. They try and measure your genes and make some kind of prediction about whether or not you're going to become obese or not. Fundamentally misunderstanding the difference between calculating population level risk, where you need hundreds of thousands of people to say that on average you are going to be heavier or lighter, versus taking that same number and making a prediction. Okay, which is very, very different, statistically speaking. So don't waste your money going to these companies to find out if you're likely to become obese or not, or your aerobic capacity, or anything along those lines. So listen, just a couple of final thoughts, and then I'll take questions. So let's deal with the question of blame. Okay, of excuses, of giving someone an excuse. Am I giving anyone an excuse? I'm going to argue no. So you got to consider your genes. This is my hand of poker analogy. You got to consider your genes like a hand of poker. You can have good hands, you can have bad hands, and you can't do anything about it. The only people you can actually blame are your parents, because that's where the genes have come from. But you can win with a bad hand of poker. It's just more difficult. Let me give you another analogy. I will never, ever run as fast as Usain Bolt, and it's because of my genes and I'm sticking to it. But it doesn't mean that if I train, I won't run faster than I do now. People misunderstand what genetics do for us. They think that it represents, it's deterministic, that your mix of genes determines who you are in a point in space and time. And this is not true. I mean, look, your genes do bracket a range of possibilities. Of course it does. Why am I bald? It's because of my genes. Why do I look Chinese? It's because of my genes. Okay, but what geneticists are trying to understand, okay, is the bracket of possibilities, because then within there, people can move up and move down according to the environmental impact. How rich or poor you are you making good or bad decisions? Do you live next to a takeaway or not? All these kind of things that influence where you move up and where you move down. Okay, so I just thought I would, and two more points to make. So the penultimate point is the dessert tummy. There is a reason for this. It exists. I promise you. All right. So let me explain to you. So let's review what a dessert tummy is. We've all been there. We go to a place. We eat our main. We're really full, and when the chocolate cake comes, we will still have the chocolate cake. The question to ask, however, is why is it specific for the chocolate cake? So if you went to a steak and chips place, for example, and it was all you can eat, and you stuffed yourself full, then you're not going to eat any more steak and chips, but yet you'll eat the chocolate cake. There's a reason for this. All right. So 50,000 years ago, Serengeti. All right. This is an antelope. Okay. So now imagine it's taken me 2,000 calories to take down the antelope. So what would I have to do if I went back to when I went back to the village? I'd have to eat at least 2,000 calories, because otherwise at some point you'll die. All right. So that's fine. But there is no guarantee you'll get the antelope the next time around. So your brain, the part of your brain, the hedonic part of your brain, which makes eating feel good, the feeling in food, which you get for chocolate cake and not broccoli, takes over to make sure you eat more than you need to buffer against the time you don't have the antelope. But how do you get past the mechanical difficulty of being stuffed full of 2,000 calories worth of venison? Okay. Your brain begins to change the type of calorie it craves. It begins to increase the caloric density of the food it wants, which means that for every given gram of food, you have more calories in it. So what are the foods highest in caloric density? Foods that are high in sugar and high in fat. What are foods that are high in sugar and fat? Desserts. Your dessert tummy is a holdover from the time in Serengeti to ensure that even while stuffed full of venison, that you could change the type of food you eat to continue stuffing in more calories to make sure you keep yourself alive. Now, my last conservation point. Now you might be thinking, how can it be conserved? How can animals don't have dessert? Okay, that's true. Take the grizzly bear. Stop. The grizzly bear is not eating a Taro citron and having a muscat. Okay, but take the grizzly bear, Pacific Northwest of North America, hitting the salmon run to prepare itself for hibernation. Its role is to gain as much fat as possible. At the beginning of the salmon run, the grizzly eats the whole salmon, the whole damn salmon, okay, down to the bone. Whereas as it gets fuller and more fat, it begins to only eat the skin of the salmon and the fat underneath the skin, because this is where it is highest in caloric density. Okay, so while they don't have dessert, the phenomenon of increasing your caloric density of food you crave as you get fuller and fuller is a conserved pathway, ladies and gentlemen. So are we all sinners? Because when we talk about choice, we talk about food, we always talk about sin. Oh, it's a sin day. Oh, we need a sin tax, you know? And people talk about food as sin because they think it's a choice, because this is what sin is. Sin is something that's bad for you, yet you choose to do it. Here's me choosing to have a slice of pizza. So, and I don't like the use of the word because I really do not believe that body weight feeding behavior is not a choice. Now, you guys are looking at me stuffing the pizza and they're going, come on, you're choosing to put the pizza in your mouth, right? That's true. It might seem like that. But here is the important point. Your body weight does not or fluctuates very, very little from day to day. You do not gain or lose weight overnight. Our body weight is the function of thousands of different feeding decisions we have taken over the past few years. All right. Now, imagine because of your genes, you are 5% less likely to say no. Okay. Now, 5% less likely to say no over thousands of different feeding decisions is hundreds of thousands of calories difference between one person and another, which is why some people are small, medium, and large in this environment. Here's me choosing to eat a broccoli. People living with obesity are not morally bereft. They're not bad. They're not slothful. Okay, they are fighting their biology. It doesn't change the physics. I never said anything about changing physics. We still need to get people who need to lose weight to eat less. But until we as society understand the huge role that biology and our genes play in influencing our feeding behavior and our body weight, until we understand that for some people it's more difficult than others, until we understand that it is biology, we will never be able to put together any kind of long-standing, sustainable a strategy for people to lose weight. So listen, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to me. I want to thank my senior colleagues, Stephen O'Rahilly, Tony Call, Eleanor Raffin, who did all the Labrador work. And this is my team. I'm based at the MRC Metabolic Diseases Unit right here on the Cambridge Biomedical Campus at the University of Cambridge. I'm funded by the BBSRC as well. You can follow me on Twitter should you be of any interest. It's been a delight and a pleasure to speak to you. I'm happy to do questions and answer now. Thank you very much, guys.
Lovely. Thanks, Giles. That was brilliant. And I now think to myself, when my dog is looking at me with his little puppy dog eyes, he doesn't
hungry.
Love me. He doesn't love me, the little horror. Anyway, thank you ever so much. We've got a few questions that have come in, but one from my own that just made me start to think about this. If clearly what you're saying is based by the data, how do public health messages need to evolve to be able to help those people who are having to make those choices?
I think public health I think public health policy in general, rather than just messages. Public health policy at the moment, as you can see from the latest childhood obesity program from Boris Johnson after he underwent his Damascene conversion, after he got COVID, okay, still pushes a lot of personal responsibility. Yeah. Listen, folks, there's obviously some personal responsibility. It's my body, it's my children's health. Of course, you gotta make some kind of effort. But if there are gonna be people who are more susceptible, okay, and we don't actually fix the environment outside, then how are we going to fix the problem? So I think public health messaging is important, but it needs to be careful not to be overly judgmental and certainly not to blame. Very different pointing out a problem, of which obesity is a problem. No one is denying this, and blaming the people suffering from the problem. So I think we need to make sure that policymakers understand it isn't a choice, and therefore we need to strategize appropriately. But the messaging that's out there cannot blame people for something they cannot do about, but actually be more helpful, supportive, and actually make the healthier choice the easier and cheaper choice. Okay, and a more convenient choice, and that is how we're going to actually try and fix this problem we're in.
So things like the sugar tax, for example, and the difference that made, I think there was something came out, was it last week or the week before, showing the reduction in consumption. Those sorts of things would be more worthwhile to promote and to help, rather than kind of being the more kind of, I don't know.
So I think that's an interesting point, and I think the sugar beverage tax has certainly been very effective. But I guess we as society, okay, look, they're almost, let's take the extremes for a moment and what we might want to do, all right? Because we could be entirely prohibition. Your children cannot have chocolate cakes for their birthday party.
Quite right.
Utterly ridiculous. Okay, you could be fully libertarian. Okay, meaning that Hunger Games, you do what the hell you want. And equally, to my mind, an equally ridiculous thing to do. Obesity and diet-related illnesses is a public health problem and will require public health solutions. But we also need society on board. So between those two extremes, it's going to be some middle ground that is going to be acceptable to the majority of people within that society. It may change from society to society, from culture to culture. Of course it may. But I think that's what we've got to do. We as a society have to understand, well, what liberties are we willing to give up for our health, okay, et cetera, so that our kids still can have their birthday party, but I'm not being assaulted by chocolate when I go to BP to get diesel, all right? So I think that is the middle ground we're trying to, I would like to think we should be able to find in a mature society that can have a non-hysterical debate.
One day we'll get there.
One day we'll get there.
A couple of questions that have come in. Someone's asking, do you think there is scope for drugs for obesity based on your work?
So the answer is yes. I mean, for those of you, I mean, I'm obviously interested because this is my field. I think, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago now, there was a big hoopla about this new once daily injection of this drug called semaglutide, which actually reduces up to 15%, no, on average, 15% of your body weight over a year and a half, okay? And so this particular drug, for example, is actually a gut hormone mimic. So most gut hormones, when they signal to your brain, signal full, I'm full, stop eating, all right? So this particular drug mimics gut hormones so that when you inject it, it fools your brain into thinking that you're fuller, so you end up eating less. Now, this is an injectable at the moment. There's also other things you can do, for example, bariatric surgery, but less people want to do that. So I think there's going to be a spectrum. There's going to be a situation where some people are so severely ill from being obese, they need surgery. Others actually need pharmaceutical aids, whereas others, lifestyle interventions will do. It's going to be a spectrum depending on the severity and the reason you got to the obesity you are in to begin with. So yes, I think pharmaceuticals are going to form one of the important tools, but not the only tool in trying to fix obesity.
Yeah. So there is no silver bullet.
No, there isn't.
I'm not sure if you can answer this. Someone has said that my Labrador isn't motivated by food, never has been, and has now developed insulin-dependent diabetes. Maybe I should have his genes looked at.
Okay, so for those of you with Labradors and are interested, and this is sounds like a recruitment opportunity here. If you Google Go Dogs stands for Genetic of Obesity Dogs. Just Go Dogs and put Cambridge at the end. You'll find the Go Dogs webpage, which is run by Eleanor, and a number of things you can do. There's a questionnaire for you to fill in. So this is a very low, light touch. But if you are really interested in having your genes looked at, there is a way of it, because we're interested in Labradors not motivated by food primarily because there's so few of them. So undoubtedly, if you're out there with your dog, Go Dogs, Cambridge, please Google and please sign up for the study.
Lovely. So some of the questions that have come in before today's event, someone has said, how does someone with a thyroid problem stop themselves becoming obese?
That's more difficult, okay, because now we have the thyroid problem is not equivalent, different biology, but it's equivalent to the child without leptin. So that's a child with a mutation within the leptin pathway, whereas someone with a thyroid problem, either too much or too little thyroid, okay, is also going to have a biological problem. So that's a very different scenario, and that you'll have to go to your doctor and endocrinologist, and the likelihood is you would either have to take more or less of thyroxine of the stuff that is there in order to try and fix the problem, because that now we have a specific pathway. There's going to be a way of actually tweaking those pathways to solve your specific problems.
Someone else has asked, can glucose tablets taken during the first or second trimester of pregnancy be a factor in child obesity?
Okay, that is a multi-part question, actually. So the question is, can what you do during pregnancy, let's generalize it. Can what you do during pregnancy influence what your child does? The answer is yes. I think most mothers instinctively know this because you're sharing a blood circulation. So clearly, if you're healthy or unhealthy, whatever you want to choose, whatever you're eating will influence your child. I don't know about the glucose tablets specifically, but for example, we know that famously from actually a lot of work that was actually done here on the Cambridge Biomedical campus, where during the Dutch hunger winter, this is just as an example. So this was the period just after World War II. There was a short period of time, I forgot exactly, I think it was about 6 months, in which there was in effect a famine. They couldn't get rations in, all right, just for a very short period of time. And there were pregnant women then, okay, unsurprisingly. But then everything was fixed and then everyone was fine. So there were a cohort of pregnant women who had low protein diets because of rationing and were pregnant. And these babies, when they then were born into an environment that wasn't low protein, that was a normal environment, they suddenly had an increased likelihood of becoming type 2 diabetic. Because what would have happened is the baby was thinking, there's not enough food in here, okay? And thinking, I'm going to prepare myself for an environment where there's very little food when I come out, okay? This is in utero programming. And then when it came out, but there was plenty of food. And so therefore this mix between I was prepared for something, but met with another environment increases your likelihood. So this was an oblique way of actually answering the glucose question, but undoubtedly, so I don't know about the glucose specifically, but what you do when you're pregnant can influence the long-term health of your baby. But I think most pregnant mothers instinctively understand that.
Okay, and I think it's probably going to be the final question, looking at the time that we have, is do you have any thoughts on fat activists and big body positive movements having an effect on obesity figures?
Yes, I do actually. So look, I understand why body positivity is there, because people with obesity have been made fun of all their life. But we have to understand this. Okay, I'm going to be trying quick with this answer. Why is carrying too much fat bad for you? Let's please, and undoubtedly it is. Okay. Now, what is obesity? My definition of obesity is not BMI above 30. It's carrying too much fat such that it begins to influence your health. That's the critical thing, okay? So it's a nuance. So people misunderstand what happens when we gain or lose weight. They think we gain or lose fat cells. Not true, okay? Our fat cells are like balloons. They get bigger and they get smaller when you gain or lose weight. All right. The safest place to store fat is in the fat cell, because that's its professional role. All right. It's only when it's not in there, when it leaks out, then it goes to your liver and your muscle, and it causes metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, blah, blah, blah. Okay. But here's the really interesting thing, is that people can have fat cells of different sizes before the fat begins to not be safely stored. Safe fat carrying capacity. So East Asian people that look like me, South Asian people, Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, famously, we don't have to get that heavy before we get a risk of type 2 diabetes. We have a lower safe carrying fat capacity than white people, or famously Polynesians, who can get a lot larger. So because of our safe fat carrying capacity. So I guess here is my final point. I think within a population, there can be health at many sizes. You can be BMI 30 and be healthy, and be BMI 22 and have diabetes. But for yourself, for every single individual, they cannot be health at every size, because the moment you surpass your safe fat carrying capacity, your own safe fat carrying capacity, you will become ill. So that is my answer and the nuance to the body positivity movement.
That's brilliant. Do you know, I've really enjoyed today. So it's such a shame that we haven't got more time. So thank you ever so much, Giles. And also thank you to everyone who has joined us today. We've got some more on-tour sessions coming up. We have two as part of the Cambridge Festival. One is about a day in our lives, about PhD students explaining in very short films what they do. And also there is a Q&A session with a lady called Annie Howlett and some of her PhD colleagues who are looking to explain to young people about why they should get into life sciences. And then we have a CBC wellness campaign on the 15th of April, where local charity Blue Smile will be coming to talk about supporting children through through turbulent times. So all that information is available on the CUHP and CBC websites and also the social media. So thanks again, Giles, for giving up your time to speak to us, and also to the rest of you. Hope you have a great rest of the day. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
See you, folks.